Yes, the handout today is mint green because somebody named Rob left a bunch of mint green paper in the photocopier. I was going to throw them out and reprint them, but I thought, hey, if the first word in the title is grasshopper, why not go with it? It works. So we've got green outlines today, a little festivity you can thank Rob for. That being said, I've done a lesson very similar to this a number of years ago, and I had kind of a fun introduction where I put a list of names up there, and I think the cat's out of the bag. I think you know where I'm going with this, so it wouldn't be much of a surprise as it was a number of years ago, but I put the name of the 10 spies who gave the bad report without any handout, without anybody knowing what my topic was, and I said, I'm going to put names up one at a time. Raise your hand if you know who any of these people are. And nobody raised their hand. So I can't quite do the same surprise this morning, but I would challenge you to, off the top of your head, name one of the 10 spies not named Joshua or Caleb. And I would be impressed if you could remember one or two of them, let alone all 10 of their names. And the simple point is this, that history forgets those who play it safe. These 10 spies were losers. And history doesn't care about losers. We remember Joshua and Caleb because they did the incredible by putting their faith in God. And so this morning the lesson is quite simple. I'm going to emphasize fear and how we overcome fear and what fear does to us and how fear can skew our thought process and skew our vision of things and make us make bad decisions, and how we can overcome that fear by looking ultimately at the example of Joshua and Caleb. So really simple format this lesson. If you'll be turning to Numbers chapter 13, I'm going to start in Numbers chapter 13 this morning, and we're going to read a little bit of the story and simply make some observations about the fearful characteristics of the 10 spies versus the faithful characteristics of Joshua and Caleb. So Numbers chapter 13, we're going to start in verse 25. If you'll read along with me. Numbers chapter 13, beginning in verse 25, and we'll go maybe 9 or 10 verses into chapter 14. We'll just read the story and then have some discussion about it. When they returned from spying out the land at the end of 40 days, and you know at the beginning of this chapter, Moses told them, take your time, you have 40 days. He wanted a full report, not just about the quality of the land, the quality of the produce of the land. He wanted to know about the types of people who inhabited the land, and do they live in just small settlements of tents or major fortified cities. This was a 40-day, journey. They were supposed to take their time and have a detailed report so that they would know the ins and the outs of the land they were about to take possession of. And so at the end of 40 days, it says in verse 26, they proceeded to come to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the sons of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. And they brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. We remember, maybe some of you had little action figure illustrations of this in your Bible class as a kid, where you've got a cluster of grapes that was so large it was carried on a pole between two men. And so they bring these samples and show them to the congregation. Thus they told them and said, we went into the land where you sent us, and it certainly does flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Everything is as God said it would be. God made a promise that this would be an amazing place, fruitful, a land flowing with milk and honey, and they say it is exactly as God said it would be. However, in verse 28, the people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large, and moreover we saw the descendants of Anak there. Amalek is living in the land of the Negev, and the Hittites and the Jebusites, and the Amorites are living in the hill country, and the Canaanites are living by the sea and by the side of the Jordan. So this is nothing wrong quite yet. They're just giving the full report. Everything is as fruitful as God said it would be, and you asked us to check out the inhabitants, and they're very strong. Very strong. And the people are getting upset about this. to the point where it says in verse 30 that Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "We should by all means go up and take possession of it, for we shall surely overcome it." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We're not able to go up against the people. They're too strong for us." For they gave out to the sons of Israel a bad report. And I love when the Bible does that. The Bible simply calls it like it is. Like when we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 about the wicked person, and that's exactly what it says about the man who has his father's wife. It says, "Remove the wicked person from your midst." It doesn't say the confused person, the person who is in love with the wrong person. No, he says remove the wicked person. And the same thing, it doesn't beat around the bush. It simply says the men who had given out the bad report. That's what it is. It was a bad report which they had spied out, saying, "The land through which we have gone and spying it out is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people whom we saw in it are men of great size. There also we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, are part of the Nephilim." And that word Nephilim, I think it's a generic term for giant. "And we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight." And so you get a little bit of the attitude that they had. At first, they simply give a detailed report and say they're very strong. Caleb says, "Let's go do it. Surely it's ours. God will give it to us." And then they say, "Well, hold on. We can't just go take it. They're stronger than us. And they're giants. And we're like little bugs that they'll squish us. We can't do this." And so now the congregation of Israel is in an uproar. They're ready to rebel and turn right around in chapter 14. All the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. And all the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, "Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. And why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become plunder. Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt?" So they said to one another, "Let us appoint a leader and return to Egypt." Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces in the presence of all the assembly of the congregation of the sons of Israel, and Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, of those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes. And by the way, I read in a few commentaries that suggest when Moses and Aaron fell on their faces, that was their way of saying, okay, God's about to destroy him. We're going to bow down before God because he's on his way to destroy him. That was their way of saying, destruction is coming imminently, because they could see the people were treading on very thin ice. And so Joshua and Caleb spoke to the congregation in verse 7. They said, "The land which we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord is pleased with us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord. Do not fear the people of the land, for they shall be our prey. Their protection has been removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them." But all the congregation said to stone them with stones. Then the glory of the Lord appeared in the tent of meeting to all the sons of Israel. And we'll pick up the story a little bit later on. But we got plenty to talk about right there. We want to begin by talking about some observations we learn, some things we learn about fear. Again, it twists our perspective. It skews our vision. When we give in to fear, we don't think straight, we don't make good decisions. And if there's one point I can make clearly this morning, it's that decisions based upon fear are not good decisions. They are not well thought out. They are not the product of intellect or trust in God, but they result in bad things. When fear determines your course of action, you will go down a very bad path. That is the simple lesson we learn. Yet we can learn several things if we dig a little bit deeper. One of the things I noticed here, and maybe you caught that too, is how their story escalates. Early in chapter 13, the first report is that the land is good and the people there are very strong. But they don't necessarily give a recommended course of action right away. Caleb suggests, let's go take it right now. And then the story kind of escalates. It's not just that they're very strong people, it's that they're very, very strong people, and they're giants. And we're like little grasshoppers. We're like bugs in their sight. They'll squish us. We can't do this. Fear has a way of exaggerating problems. We notice their pessimistic attitude. Fear views problems as becoming so insurmountable, so complicated, that we're virtually helpless before them. That's what fear does. It can take a problem that is easily solved, and when you let fear take over, it takes that problem and turns it into something that, in your eyes, you're like a little bug going up against a giant. It's impossible. We cannot do this. And it is so easy to buy into that mentality, to become pessimistic like that. In this day and age, it's not possible to raise children who fear God and follow His commands because there's too many negative influences. That's the mentality a lot of Christians buy into. I'll do my best, but I just don't think it's even possible today. Because we're afraid of the influences of this world, we talk ourselves into a corner where there is no way to win. There is no possible good outcome to this because we are afraid. When we give into a pessimistic attitude, our problems become exaggerated. We look around and see we're not a very large church. And we start to worry that we're outnumbered in this part of the country. And so how can we possibly be successful in teaching the gospel to others? How can we possibly have any measure of success when we're so greatly outnumbered and we're such a small little group of faithful followers of the Bible right here? How can we possibly have success? We let our problems become bigger, become something we cannot solve, something that is out of our ability to deal with or cope with when we give into fear or when we become pessimistic like they had. And so that's something we find out, is that fear tends to exaggerate the problems. So they looked at the size and the strength of their enemy. They let the fear dig into their hearts, and it came to the point where they said, we are helpless. We can't defeat them. It is impossible. We're like tiny little bugs to them. That's how their problems have become exaggerated. Something else we realize about fear is that it's oftentimes the majority viewpoint. People like to find strength in numbers. They find security. If everybody else feels the same way, well, then I must be right because I'm standing with the majority. But, when you read Matthew chapter 7, the scripture that Jesus talks about, there is a narrow way that leads to life, but there is a broad path, and many who are on that path, and its end is destruction. You begin to realize that safety in numbers is false. That's just not the way things are. And a big reason why so many people are on that path is that they give into fear. In Revelation chapter 21, there's a reason. This verse has always sunk in with me. This doesn't seem like something that bad to be cowardly. But a coward is someone who yields to their fears, who would rather find strength in numbers and a false sense of safety than trusting in God. In Revelation 21 and verse 8, but for the cowardly and unbelieving and abominable and murderers and immoral persons and sorcerers and idolaters and all liars, their part will be in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. God says, I have no place for the coward. I have no place for somebody who lets fear control their lives. And so we understand that fear is oftentimes the majority viewpoint. We see that in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 37, it specifies 600,000 men. That's just the men. Now, if we figure in women and children, this number could be upwards of 2 million individuals. There's no way to know for certain, but that seems plausible. 2 million make up this congregation of Israel. And we see in Numbers chapter 14 and verse 1 the contagious nature of fear. When just 10 people who are afraid, their fear spreads and consumes an entire congregation, an entire nation numbering in the millions. That's how fear spreads. It's contagious. Strength in numbers, standing with the majority, that sometimes is just an illusion. Joshua and Caleb, along with Moses and Aaron, stood by themselves. Yet God was with them. Oftentimes the majority is wrong. Fear misses out on opportunities. Fear has a way of immobilizing you. And that's what we find here. We kind of abruptly ended our text, but if you go back to Numbers chapter 14, I'd like to read a little bit further. Numbers chapter 14, let's pick up in verse 19. So I'm taking for granted that a lot of us know how the story goes, that, we left off in verse 10, that the glory of the Lord appeared in the tent of meeting to all the sons of Israel, and we know he was ready for some fireworks. He was ready to put an end to these people who had turned their backs on him and turned their backs on his chosen leaders. But we also know that Moses, a foreshadowing of Jesus, was their advocate. And he pleaded their case, and God decided that that generation, for over the next 40 years, anybody over 20 years old, God says, I can wait. I'll wait for every one of you to die off in the wilderness. And that's still pretty merciful, considering God could have destroyed them. God could have sent them back to Egypt as slaves. They were allowed to live out their lives as free people. That's still pretty merciful, considering how they provoked the Lord. I always thought, how would you like to be the last survivor from that generation? Everybody's just waiting for you to die. I wouldn't want to be that person. But that's not quite the end of the story. That's the punishment God deals out. It says, you don't get the promised land. You don't, but your children do. And I love that. They were afraid. It says in verse 2, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become plunder. They thought, we need to do what's best for our wives and our children. And God says, your children who you thought would be plunder, they get the land, but you don't. But Israel shows their stubbornness once again in verse 19. Chapter 14, verse 19. Actually, let's start in verse 20. So the Lord said, I have pardoned them according to your word. But indeed, as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord. Surely all the men who have seen my glory and my signs, which I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, yet have put me to the test these 10 times, and have not listened to my voice, shall by no means see the land which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who spurned me see it. But my servant Caleb, because he has had a different spirit and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land which he has entered, and his descendants shall take possession of it. Now the Amalekites and the Canaanites who live in the valleys turn tomorrow and set out to the wilderness by the way of the Red Sea. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, how long shall I bear with this evil congregation who are grumbling against me? I've heard the complaints of the sons of Israel, which they are making against me. Say to them, as I live, just as you have spoken in my hearing, so I will surely do to you. How many times do they say, we should have just died in the wilderness? Wouldn't that have been better? We should have just stayed in Egypt. We should have died there rather than come all the way here to die by the sword. And God says, you've said it enough times. I'm going to let that be the self-fulfilling prophecy. You do get to just die in the wilderness. As you've spoken, so it will happen to you. But look in verse 40. Let's skip ahead a little bit. I mentioned their stubbornness. God says, you surely will not take possession of this land. Yet, they come in verse 40, the next morning, it says, however, they arose up early and went up to the ridge of the hill country, saying, here we are. We've indeed sinned, but we will go up to the place which the Lord has promised. He said, God, now we'll do what you want. And God says, through Moses, no, I've declared my punishment. Doesn't matter that now you're sorry. You had your chance. I brought you right up to this land, and I was going to give it to you right now. You had your chance, but because of fear, you missed your opportunity because you were sitting on the sidelines afraid to make the move. They missed their opportunity. And so Moses said to them, "Why then are you transgressing the commandment of the Lord when it will not succeed? Do not go up, lest you be struck down before your enemies. For the Lord is not among you. He won't help you." They go fight them anyway. And it says in verse 45, the Amalekites and the Canaanites who lived in that hill country came down and struck them and beat them down as far as Ormah. Fear led them to miss their great opportunity. This is what happens when you play it safe. When God tells you to make a move, when God tells you you need to be bold, when God tells you you need to live a kind of life that is shocking to the world around you, that people see it and they relate your behavior to God in heaven above. When God tells you to live that distinctly, but you play it safe, you're afraid to stick out like that. You're missing your opportunity because fear immobilizes you and leaves you sitting on the sidelines. And fear leads to misplaced trust. In the first 4 verses, particularly verse 3 and 4 of chapter 14, after hearing this terrifying report that the land is inhabited by giants and well-fortified cities, I'm kind of amazed that Israel's plan, the best they could come up with is, let's go back to Egypt. As if they'd be warmly welcomed there. What were they expecting would be back there for them in Egypt? I mean, seriously, this is what fear did to them. They thought they mistrusted their enemies, those who had been hard slave drivers, those who had punished them cruelly, those who had followed them out into the wilderness at the edge of the Red Sea to hunt them down and probably destroy them, had it not been for the interference of God. And they want to go back to those people? That's what fear does. It skews your perspective. It leads you to mistrust or misplace your trust. You trust the wrong people. And I find it very chilling as I look for parallels to today that they would consider Egypt a safe place. And it says, again, I believe it's verse 4, we want to appoint a new leader and return to Egypt. You know, I have a policy of not making political statements from the pulpit, and I'm going to tiptoe around that. I'm not going to advocate one party, one candidate over another, but I'm hearing a lot of rhetoric that is based on fear. Vote for me because look at the alternative. I think both sides are saying a lot of that. If you don't vote for me, disaster's coming. A lot of candidates, not just on the presidential level, are using fear to coerce people to their side. I'm not telling you who you should or shouldn't vote for. I'm not telling you whether you should or shouldn't vote in the first place. That's your choice. But I am telling you, do not make those kind of decisions based on fear. Think about your motivations and why you're voting for the people you're voting for. This is exactly what happened. Their fear led them to misplace their trust in the wrong source. Rather than trusting God, they looked to Egypt of all places, as their safe place. Because fear twisted their thinking to where they thought, that might be a good option. Again, decisions that are based on fear are bad decisions. So think about your motives and who you trust in life, and if you're so inclined to be involved with politics and voting, I think there's an application there. That's as much as I'm going to tiptoe across that political line this morning. So just a few observations about fear. It really twisted their thought process, and they missed their golden opportunity. So how do we overcome fear? We look to the example of the faithful two. Again, strength is not necessarily found by being in the majority. Strength is found by siding with God, by having faith in God. And that's what these two men had. They had confidence not in themselves, not in Israel's ability. I mean, these people didn't have horses and chariots. They didn't really have weaponry, so to speak, at least heavy armaments like other nations had. They had no city walls to hide behind. Joshua and Caleb did not have confidence in Israel or themselves, but they did have an abundance of confidence in God. Numbers chapter 14 Again, notice verse 9. Numbers chapter 14, verse 9. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they shall be our prey. Their protection has been removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. It starts with confidence in God. When God says, I can, we believe that. We look at the creation and see all of God's handiwork, and we know his power. We know what he is capable of. We look to our own lives and see the kind of people we used to be, and we know God has the power to transform us, to change us from the heart out. So we need to have confidence in God, and that's what Joshua and Caleb had. And they had courage. Courage is standing up in the minority regardless of the consequences. Did you catch that in verse 10 of chapter 14, that not only were they looking to appoint a new leader who would lead them back to Egypt, but they wanted to stone Moses and Aaron, and probably Joshua and Caleb too? Facing down that type of retaliation, that type of punishment, being stoned, Caleb still said, I'm standing on this side. I'm not afraid of what you do. That's courage, and that's what we need to have. Let's look ahead to Joshua chapter 14. If you want to know a little bit about the courage and confidence that Caleb had in God, look in Joshua chapter 14. So we're moving ahead narrative-wise. This is after the 40 years in the wilderness. That faithless generation had died off, and now under the leadership of Joshua, Moses is gone too, they get to now take possession of the land. And hopefully this generation learned from their previous generation's mistakes. It's time to go take possession of the land, and here's what Caleb said. Caleb, because he was faithful, he basically gets first pick. Caleb, what area do you want? You've earned it. Pick which part of the promised land looks best to you, and that gets to be your inheritance. So Joshua chapter 14, and look at verse 12. Now then, give me this hill country about which the Lord spoke on that day. For you heard on that day that Anakim were there with great fortified cities. Perhaps the Lord will be with me, and I shall drive them out as the Lord has spoken. Caleb got first choice. You know what he said? I want those strong cities that they talked about. I'll take those. I bet God will be on my side. I'm 85 years old, but I'm just as strong as I was when I was 40. God has been with me, and God promised, so I want those cities with the giants and the strong walls. Caleb could have said, nah, I'm going to take that corner over there with the little wandering band of nomads. We could wipe them out pretty easily. That seems easy. Caleb said, no, I want the bad guys. I want the big giants. Bring them on. I'll take them with God's help. That's courage and that's confidence. And so we face down giants today. We face down problems that if we give into fear, our problems get magnified and they seem insurmountable. But when we have confidence and courage, we face down our giants just like Caleb. We face down whatever suffering, whatever hardships. When it comes to temptation and sin, we need courage. Say, I don't care how scary my problems look. I don't care how outgunned I seem to be, but with God on my side, I will conquer. And that's the attitude that Joshua and Caleb had. They were optimistic, very optimistic. And all of us need this attitude as well. Numbers chapter 13 and verse 30. Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, we should by all means go up and take possession of it, for we shall surely overcome it. There's confidence and there's optimism. He was positive. And, you know, I think I understand. When you read 1 Corinthians chapter 10, you know, the first several verses, the first dozen verses of 1 Corinthians 10, it talks about how, you know, God's chosen people were not above falling out of grace with God. And so as Christians today, we need to understand we're not so high that we can't fall. Why did God destroy them, it says in 1 Corinthians 10? Because they grumbled, because they complained. You know, I can only take so much negativity. And that's all you see on the internet. That's all you see on Facebook. That's all you see on message boards. People tearing down other people, people being mean, petty, cruel, insulting. I can only take so much negativism in my life before I cut that person out of my life. Don't be the complainer. Nobody likes being around somebody who complains constantly. Be optimistic. Be positive. Be upbeat. Because God has given you the victory already. That's reason to be optimistic and cheery. They showed leadership by having a good influence. And that's something we need to understand. Leadership doesn't always mean you influence people in the here and now. Joshua and Caleb did their best, but you know what? What do you think that younger generation, how do you think they reacted when they saw their parents die in the wilderness, but Joshua and Caleb were still there 40 years later, leading the way? It might have been slow and in God's time, but they had a powerful influence for good because of their strong leadership. It just wasn't immediately realized. And they had faith, a deep-rooted faith in God. And here's really the key, the main difference between these two men and the other 10 and all of Israel. So they had faith in God. They said, God is with us. He's on our side. Do you understand that? Do you believe that in your life? We're told that faith comes by hearing the Word of God. If you want faith in God, you need to know who He is. You need to know the wonderful things He's done for others, for yourself. You need to know the kind of power He wields in creating this world, power that we can't even comprehend. If we want faith, we've got to hear it. We've got to see it. We've got to know God. We've got to dig into His Word and know Him. So if you want to overcome fear, you need faith. And you're not going to get that apart from the Word of God. And they were obedient. This is something that, I stress this often. God's way of doing things is simply the best. It's the best way. It might not always make sense to us when God tells us to do it this way, but the rest of the world does it this way. But God's way is best, and that's where we need to trust Him. They were obedient. They did things His way. It says it so many times. If you want to know what separated Joshua and Caleb from the rest, it comes down to really these two things. They had faith in God, and that faith led them to obey His commands. Numbers chapter 14, verse 24. Numbers 14 and verse 24. When God is declaring the punishment, He says, "But my servant Caleb, because he has had a different spirit and has followed me fully." Numbers chapter 32 and verse 11. Numbers chapter 32 and verse 11. "None of the men who came up from Egypt from 20 years old and upward shall see the land which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, for they did not follow me fully, except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, the son of Nun, for they have followed the Lord fully." Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 36. "Except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, he shall see it, and to him and to his sons I will give the land which he has set foot, because he has followed the Lord fully." And again, it repeats that in Joshua chapter 14, where we just read about Caleb choosing to take possession of the fortified cities with the giants. That's what set them apart. They had faith in God. They trusted Him to the point where they followed His commands. So if you want to overcome fear, here's a few good suggestions. It's not about confidence in your strength or your abilities. It's confidence in God, which should lead to courage and courageous behavior, where we're not afraid to stand with the minority. We don't need that false sense of security by standing with the majority. We stand with God wherever that is, whatever side of the line that is, we're with God. We're optimistic and cheerful. We lead by example, and we have faith and obedience in God. That's what will keep you from giving into fear. So who do you want to be like this morning? Who do you want to be like the rest of your lives? Do you want to be like those 10 fearful spies? The ones who played it safe, did the safe things, said, we got to worry about our wives and our children and, do what's best for them. And sorry, God, we can't do it your way. It's just too difficult. The losers that nobody remembers? Or do you hope to find yourself at the end of your life a little bit more like Joshua and Caleb? Said, I don't care about everybody else, what they do. I'm going to stand with God. If you're ready to make a decision like that, if you're ready to declare your faithfulness to God and obedience to Him, to be baptized, or whether you are a Christian, you need prayers or encouragement, you're ready to side with God. We want to encourage you and help you in that endeavor. Please come forward now as we stand and sing.